I still remember the way the courtroom fell silent. 10 years had passed since my divorce, yet in that moment it felt as though every painful mile of the journey had led straight back to that room. My ex-husband Daniel sat across from me at the custody hearing. Our son Ethan was 11 years old now. The judge had already reviewed school records, financial statements, medical documents, and testimony from teachers. Everyone expected a ruling. Then the judge adjusted his glasses and said quietly, "Before I make my final decision, I'd like to review one additional document." He held up a folder. My complete military service record. I felt a small knot tighten in my stomach. The judge opened the file and began reading. A few seconds passed. Then several more. His expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough that everyone in the room noticed. He stopped reading and slowly looked up. His eyes settled on Daniel. For the first time that day, Daniel looked nervous. The judge lowered the document onto his desk. Daniel leaned forward. "What is it?" he asked. The judge didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced back at the file. Daniel's face began to lose color. Then I heard him whisper the words that would stay with me forever. "No, that's impossible." And just like that, my mind drifted back 10 years, back to the day everything fell apart, back to the day my husband walked away. At 30 years old, I thought I knew exactly what my future looked like. I was a logistics officer in the U.S. Army. I loved my work. I loved the structure, the purpose, and the people I served beside. Most of all, I loved my family. Daniel and I had been married for 4 years. Our son Ethan had just celebrated his first birthday. Life wasn't perfect, but it felt stable. Then one training exercise changed everything. It happened during a large-scale field operation. One moment I was inside a military vehicle with several other soldiers. The next chaos exploded around us. Metal screamed. The vehicle rolled. Equipment crashed through the cabin. I remember pain, then darkness. When I woke up in the hospital, doctors explained the extent of my injuries. Multiple fractures in my pelvis, serious damage to both legs, months of rehabilitation ahead. The good news, they said, was that I would likely recover. The bad news was that recovery would take a long time. I tried to stay positive. After all, I was alive. Many soldiers recover from worse injuries. But as the weeks passed, another fear began to grow inside me. Not fear of pain, not fear of surgery, fear of becoming a burden. Daniel visited often at first. He brought Ethan whenever he could. I lived for those visits. Watching my little boy wobble across the hospital floor made every difficult day easier. Yet something had changed in Daniel. At first I blamed exhaustion. He was caring for a baby, working full-time, driving back and forth to the hospital. Of course he was tired. I kept apologizing. "I'm sorry," I told him one afternoon. "For what?" "For putting all of this on you." He forced a smile. "It's fine." But it didn't feel fine. The warmth that had once existed between us seemed to be disappearing. His visits became shorter. His conversations became colder. Sometimes he stared at his phone more than he looked at me. I noticed. I just didn't want to believe what I was seeing. Months later, I was finally discharged. I returned home in a wheelchair. The doctors were optimistic. They expected improvement. But there were no guarantees about how quickly it would happen. The first few weeks were difficult. Simple tasks suddenly required help. Getting dressed, moving around the house, bathing safely. Every bit of independence I had taken for granted was gone. I hated it. Still, I kept reminding myself that recovery was a process. One step at a time, one day at a time. Then one afternoon, Daniel came home unusually early. He didn't say much. He walked into the kitchen and placed a stack of papers on the table beside my wheelchair. I looked down. Divorce papers. For a moment, I honestly thought it was some kind of mistake. I stared at the documents. Then I looked up at him. "What is this?" His face showed no emotion. "I can't do this anymore, Emily." My heart began pounding. "What are you talking about?" He folded his arms. "I didn't sign up for this." The words hit harder than any injury I'd suffered. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. Then I noticed a car parked outside. A woman stepped out. Young, confident, waiting. Daniel picked up a suitcase I hadn't even realized he'd packed. My entire body went cold. "Daniel," he didn't answer. He walked to the front door. Then right in front of me, he walked outside and kissed her. I sat frozen in my wheelchair, holding Ethan against my chest. Our son started crying. So did I. But Daniel never looked back. The front door closed. And just like that, my husband was gone. That night, after Ethan finally fell asleep, I sat alone in the darkness. I stared at my useless legs. I thought about everything I had lost. Then I made myself a promise. a promise that would carry me through the next decade. If I ever walked again, my son would never grow up believing his mother was weak. When people hear stories about recovery, they often expect a dramatic turning point, a miracle, a breakthrough moment, a day when everything suddenly gets better. That wasn't my experience. Learning to stand again was one of the slowest, most frustrating things I've ever done. And I've spent most of my adult life in the Army. The morning after Daniel left, I woke up with swollen eyes and a 1-year-old son depending on me. There was no time to collapse. No time to stay in bed feeling sorry for myself. Ethan needed breakfast. He needed diapers changed. He needed someone to hold him when he cried. So I kept moving forward even when moving forward felt impossible. The rehabilitation center became my second home. 3 days a week I worked with physical therapists who pushed me harder than I thought I could handle. Sometimes I hated them. Sometimes I hated myself. There were days when standing for 30 seconds felt like climbing a mountain. Days when pain shot through my pelvis so sharply that tears rolled down my face before I could stop them. One afternoon after a particularly difficult session, I sat in my car and cried for nearly 20 minutes. Not because of the pain, because I was tired. Tired of fighting. Tired of feeling broken. Tired of wondering whether Daniel had been right to leave. Then I looked into the back seat. Ethan was asleep in his car seat. His tiny hand rested against his cheek, and I remembered the promise I'd made. My son would not grow up believing his mother was weak. The next morning I went back, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. The Army had taught me many things. One of them was that discipline matters most when motivation disappears. Eventually I stood without assistance. A few weeks later I took several shaky steps. Months later I walked across a room. I wasn't graceful. I wasn't fast. But I was moving. For me that was enough. Money became another battle. Medical bills piled up. My recovery limited what kind of military assignments I could perform. I accepted administrative duties that fit within my restrictions. The work wasn't exciting, but it paid the bills. Some months were harder than others. I sold furniture. I canceled subscriptions. I learned how far a grocery budget could stretch when every dollar mattered. There were evenings when I sat at the kitchen table with a calculator and a stack of unpaid bills. The numbers never seemed to cooperate, but somehow we always made it through. Ethan never knew how worried I was. I made sure of that. Children shouldn't carry adult burdens. They deserve childhoods, not financial stress. Meanwhile, Daniel slowly disappeared from our lives. At first he called occasionally, then less often, then hardly at all. Child support checks arrived inconsistently. Sometimes months passed without anything. When I contacted him, excuses followed. Business problems, unexpected expenses, promises that next month would be different. Next month rarely was. I later learned he had built a new life with the woman he'd left me for. A new home. A new family. A fresh start. At least that's how it looked from the outside. What hurt more than his absence were the stories he told. Through mutual friends and distant relatives, I began hearing things. Daniel claimed the accident had changed me. That I wasn't emotionally stable. That military trauma had made me unpredictable. A few people believed him. Others weren't sure what to believe. At first I wanted to defend myself. I wanted to explain, to argue, to prove he was lying. But eventually I stopped. The truth doesn't always need immediate defense. Sometimes it simply needs time. So I focused on living my life. As the years passed, I became stronger. Not just physically, professionally too. I returned to full military duty. The first time I completed a full workday without limitations, I celebrated by taking Ethan out for ice cream. He was 6 by then. Old enough to understand that Mom had accomplished something important. Promotions followed. Responsibilities increased. Younger soldiers began seeking my advice. Many of them had no idea what had happened years earlier. They simply knew me as someone dependable. Someone who showed up. Someone who finished what she started. That reputation meant more to me than any rank, because it had been earned one difficult day at a time. Ethan grew into a thoughtful, kind young man. He loved science. He hated broccoli. He laughed exactly the way he had as a toddler. Every achievement felt like proof that we had survived. Together. Then just when life finally seemed steady, my phone rang one evening. I recognized the number immediately. Daniel. I almost didn't answer. Almost, but I did. His voice sounded older, less confident. After a few minutes of awkward conversation, he finally got to the point. What he said next stunned me. He wasn't calling to apologize. He wasn't calling to reconnect with Ethan. He wasn't calling to make peace. He wanted custody of our son. And for the first time in 10 years, I realized the hardest battle of my life might still be ahead of me. When Daniel said he wanted custody of Ethan, I honestly thought I had misunderstood him. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone while dinner simmered on the stove. "What do you mean custody?" I asked. There was a pause. Then he said it again, calmly, deliberately. "I think Ethan should come live with me." For several seconds I couldn't speak. Not because I was angry, because I was stunned. This was a man who had missed birthdays, missed school events, missed entire seasons of our son's life. And now when Ethan was 11 years old, he suddenly wanted custody. The conversation ended politely, but something felt wrong. Very wrong. A few weeks later, I learned the truth. Daniel's business was struggling. Badly. A mutual acquaintance mentioned it during a community event. Several investments had failed. Debt was mounting. Financial pressure was growing. Suddenly, his renewed interest in parenting made a lot more sense. Not long after that, I was served with legal papers. The custody battle had officially begun. The first court hearing felt surreal. I sat across from a man I barely recognized. Time had changed both of us. His hair was thinner. His face carried new lines. But what struck me most was how confidently he spoke, as though the previous decade had never happened, as though he had always been present. His attorney presented their argument carefully. They never directly attacked me. They didn't need to. Instead, they focused on perception. Military life, they argued, was unpredictable. Deployments created instability. Frequent obligations took parents away from home. Then they shifted toward my accident. Not openly, not aggressively, just enough to plant doubt. They referenced my injuries, my recovery, my medical history. Questions were asked that sounded reasonable on the surface. But I understood what they were doing. They wanted the court to see me as damaged, limited, potentially incapable. The irony was almost unbearable. For 10 years I had rebuilt my life piece by piece. Now strangers were discussing my abilities as if they were theoretical concepts. I listened quietly. I took notes. And I reminded myself of something the Army had taught me years earlier. Emotional reactions rarely improve difficult situations. Facts do. When it was my turn, I chose a different approach. I didn't attack Daniel. I didn't mention the woman he left with. I didn't list old betrayals. I didn't try to humiliate him. The truth was already painful enough. Instead, my attorney focused on evidence. Medical records showed my recovery. Military evaluations documented years of successful service. Financial records demonstrated stability. School records showed Ethan was thriving academically. Teachers testified about his performance and behavior. One teacher smiled while speaking about him. "Ethan is one of the most respectful students I've ever taught." Hearing that nearly brought tears to my eyes. Not because of the case, because I was proud of my son. Another teacher described him as responsible and kind. His soccer coach praised his teamwork. One by one, people painted a picture of a healthy child. A child who was succeeding. A child who felt loved. The courtroom atmosphere gradually shifted. I could feel it. Even Daniel seemed to notice. Yet despite all the evidence, the judge remained thoughtful, careful, unhurried. That worried me. Experienced judges don't rush important decisions. And custody decisions are among the most important. Several hearings later, we approached what everyone expected would be the conclusion. Most testimony had been completed. Most documents had been reviewed. My attorney felt cautiously optimistic. Even so, I couldn't relax. Too much was at stake. The morning of the final hearing, I barely slept. I arrived early and sat quietly in the courtroom. Daniel entered a few minutes later. For a brief moment, our eyes met. Neither of us smiled. Neither of us spoke. Years of history sat silently between us. When the proceedings began, the judge reviewed his notes. Then he leaned back in his chair. "I've examined substantial evidence from both parties," he said. The room became very still. My heart pounded. I expected a ruling. Instead, the judge continued. "However, there remains one unanswered issue." My attorney glanced toward me. I could tell she was surprised. So was I. The judge folded his hands. "Before I make a final determination, I want additional information." No one spoke. No one moved. The tension in that courtroom felt almost physical. What information could possibly still be missing? We had provided years of records, witnesses, evaluations, financial documentation. Everything. The judge looked directly at my attorney. Then he made a request that caught everyone off guard, including me. "I would like to review Ms. Carter's complete military service record." For a second, the room was silent. I blinked. My attorney blinked. Even Daniel looked confused. Why would that matter? The judge offered no explanation. He simply repeated the request. My complete record. Every evaluation. Every commendation. Every official entry. As the hearing ended and people began gathering their papers, an uneasy feeling settled over me. I couldn't explain it. I only knew that something important was about to happen. Something none of us had anticipated. And somewhere inside a military file that hadn't been opened in years, a forgotten piece of my past was waiting to be discovered. The final hearing began on a quiet Tuesday morning. Outside the courthouse, people hurried through their ordinary lives. Inside, my future and Ethan's felt suspended in time. I arrived early and sat beside my attorney. Neither of us spoke much. There wasn't much left to say. The evidence had already been presented. The testimony had already been heard. Everything now depended on the judge's decision. A few minutes later, Daniel entered the courtroom. He looked confident. Not arrogant, just confident. His attorney appeared equally relaxed. I remember wondering why. The judge had reviewed years of school records, financial records, military evaluations, and witness testimony. Nothing in those documents supported Daniel's argument. Yet he still seemed certain he had a chance. Then the judge entered. Everyone stood. Everyone sat. And the room became silent. The judge opened a folder resting on his desk. I recognized it immediately. My complete military service record. The same file he had requested at the previous hearing. He adjusted his glasses and began reading. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Page after page turned quietly. Occasionally, he underlined something with a pen. The courtroom remained still. Then I noticed a change. His reading slowed. He returned to an earlier page. Read it again. And then again. A strange feeling settled in my chest. Whatever he had found, it mattered. The judge finally looked up. Ms. Carter, he said. Yes, Your Honor. Were you ever formally recognized for actions taken during the training accident that resulted in your injuries? The question caught me off guard. I hadn't thought about that accident in years. Yes, sir, I answered carefully. There was an internal review afterward. The judge nodded. Then he lowered his eyes back to the document. And suddenly memories I had spent years trying to leave behind came rushing back. The vehicle had already rolled. Metal twisted around us. Equipment was scattered everywhere. People were screaming. Some soldiers managed to escape, others couldn't. I remember crawling toward an opening. I remember realizing I could get out. And I remember hearing someone calling for help. At that moment, I had a choice. Leave or go back. The logical decision would have been evacuation. I was already injured. I was bleeding. The vehicle was unstable. But logic wasn't what I was thinking about. People were trapped. So I turned around. I went back inside. Then I came out with one soldier. Then another. And another. Each trip became harder. Each movement hurt more. The pain in my legs and pelvis grew worse every time. Medics kept shouting for me to stay outside. I ignored them. Not because I was brave. Because I couldn't walk away knowing someone was still trapped. By the time the last soldier was removed, I could barely remain conscious. Only then did I allow the medics to treat me. Only then did I stop. The additional damage to my body would eventually become permanent. The doctors told me later that those repeated entries into the vehicle had significantly worsened my injuries. At the time, I didn't care. I'd make the same choice again. Every single time. The judge's voice pulled me back to the present. He was reading directly from my record. His words echoed through the courtroom. Displayed extraordinary courage by repeatedly re-entering a disabled military vehicle to rescue fellow soldiers despite imminent personal danger. The room fell completely silent. No papers shuffled. No chairs moved. No one spoke. For a moment it felt as though everyone was holding their breath. The judge continued reviewing the report. The official findings described deliberate decision-making under extreme pressure, leadership, responsibility, self-sacrifice, professional judgment. Everything Daniel's legal team had tried to question. Everything they had tried to portray as weakness. The record described the exact opposite. I glanced across the room. Daniel was staring at the judge. His expression had completely changed. The confidence was gone. The certainty was gone. Slowly, painfully, realization spread across his face. For years, he had told people I was unstable after the accident. Broken. Unreliable. Yet the official military record described a woman who had willingly accepted permanent injury to save others. A woman trusted with responsibility. A woman whose judgment had been praised, not questioned. The foundation of his entire argument was collapsing right in front of him. The judge finally closed the file. Then he looked directly at Daniel. The silence felt enormous. Daniel swallowed. His eyes flickered toward me, then back to the judge, and in a voice barely louder than a whisper, he said the words I had heard at the very beginning of this story. No, that's impossible. But it wasn't impossible. It was simply the truth. A truth that had been sitting quietly inside a military file for 10 years. The judge folded his hands. The courtroom remained silent. Then he took a breath and began reading his final ruling. The judge's voice was calm and measured as he began reading his final ruling. After months of hearings, testimony, and legal arguments, everything came down to a few simple truths. I sat perfectly still. Across the room, Daniel did the same. Neither of us interrupted. Neither of us looked away. The judge reviewed the evidence one final time. He spoke about Ethan's academic success, his emotional well-being, his stable home environment, his relationships with teachers, coaches, and friends. Then he turned to the issue that mattered most: parenting. Custody decisions, he said, are not determined by appearances, income alone, or revised versions of history. The courtroom remained silent. They are determined by consistent care, responsible decision-making, sacrifice, and demonstrated commitment to a child's well-being over time. I felt my throat tighten. The judge continued. For more than 10 years, he explained, one parent had been consistently present. One parent had attended school conferences, doctor appointments, sporting events, parent-teacher meetings. One parent had provided daily stability, daily guidance, daily love. That parent was me. Finally, the judge announced his decision. Daniel's request for custody was denied. Existing arrangements would remain in place. A wave of relief washed over me so suddenly that I had to steady myself in my chair. It wasn't victory that I felt. It was gratitude. Gratitude that the truth had been seen. Gratitude that Ethan's life would not be uprooted. Gratitude that 10 difficult years had not been erased by a carefully crafted argument. The hearing ended a few minutes later. People gathered their files. Attorneys shook hands. The judge left the courtroom. And just like that, the battle was over. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun felt surprisingly warm. I stood near the steps, waiting for my attorney to finish a conversation. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe normally. Then I heard a familiar voice. Emily. I turned. Daniel was standing a few feet away. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The anger I had carried years earlier wasn't there anymore. Time has a way of changing certain wounds. Not erasing them, but changing them. Daniel looked older than I remembered. Tired too, as though the past decade had finally caught up with him. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. I studied his face. There was no audience now. No judge, no attorneys. No advantage to be gained. Just two people standing in the aftermath of a long story. For what? I asked. A sad smile crossed his face. For all of it. His eyes drifted toward the courthouse behind us. When the judge read that record, he said, shaking his head, I realized something. I waited. I spent years convincing myself I left because you changed. His voice cracked slightly. But you didn't. He looked directly at me. I walked away from the strongest person I ever knew. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The younger version of me would have wanted revenge. Would have wanted him to suffer. Would have wanted him to feel every ounce of pain he caused. But age teaches you things. Pain teaches you things. I simply nodded. Then I said the only honest thing I could. You stopped being Ethan's father long before today. The words landed softly between us. Not cruelly. Just truthfully. His eyes lowered. But it's never too late to become part of his life, I continued. If you're willing to earn it. Daniel nodded slowly. I could see emotion building behind his eyes. For the first time in many years, I believed he was listening. Really listening. The changes didn't happen overnight. Real change rarely does. Over the following months, Daniel began showing up. Not dramatically, not perfectly, but consistently. He attended Ethan's soccer games. He called when he said he would. He listened more than he talked. Trust wasn't rebuilt in a day, or a week, or even a month. But little by little, a healthier relationship began to grow. Most importantly, Ethan was allowed to move at his own pace. No pressure. No forced forgiveness. Just time. And effort. The way healing usually works. I supported that relationship because Ethan deserved every opportunity to be loved, even if the road to that love had been complicated. Today, when I look back on everything that happened, people often ask what the hardest part was. They assume it was the accident, or the surgeries, or learning to walk again. But they're wrong. I used to think the hardest thing I'd ever do was learn to walk again. I was wrong. The hardest thing was teaching my son that bitterness doesn't make us stronger, character does. True strength isn't measured by the battles we survive. It's measured by how faithfully we keep our promises after everyone else walks away. If Emily's story reminded you that real strength often grows in silence, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please share your story in the comments, and if you enjoy heartfelt stories about resilience, family, and second chances, I'd be honored if you subscribed for the next one.